I wasn't sure if I was dreading an empty room or a full room more, but I'm really glad that you're here. So thank you for coming. Okay, so as Pat said, I'm Thea Brain. I work here locally as a behavior consultant, and today I'm talking about a peer-mediated intervention for middle school students with autism. So today I'm hoping that by the end you will all be able to name at least 4 of the critical ingredients for successful social skills instruction for students with ASD, according to a review done by Kay et al. In 2018. That you will be able to define what a PMI is, what a peer-mediated intervention is, a PMI, and describe how they can be used to increase social engagement and CAs, communicative acts, for students with ASD. And I'm hoping that you'll also be able to identify some of the potential advantages and disadvantages of a low-intensity approach to PMI and some future directions for research. So what are social skills interventions for? What is our goal when we do a social skills intervention? I mean, I think that simplistically speaking, we're really hoping that at the end of a social skills intervention, that the student who we are working with will have friends, right? So there might be lots of little steps in between, but the end goal is friendship. We want students with autism to have friends. And what is friends? What is friendship? There's this idea of reciprocity in a friendship. So it's not one-sided. There has to be some give and some take, and both are providing and receiving something from the relationship. And the definition of friendship changes over time. So it starts in preschool. When you're little, it's about I like this, you like this, we did it together, we're friends. So for example, my son came home from preschool quite recently and he said, I made a new friend. I said, oh yeah, what's her name? I don't know. I don't know what her name is. Okay, well, how do you know she's your friend? We played trains. Cool. They never played together again. But that day, they met the definition of friendship, right? But as we get older, that definition becomes quite a bit more complex. But still the basis is that we share an interest in something together and we do that thing together and we're having fun together. And so when we get into my research, you'll see that that's kind of what we base that on. But we do understand that friendship becomes more complex. There's things like trust and intimacy and all that really complicated stuff that comes in later too. So why do we even care if people have friends? There's actually lots of benefits. There's the obvious ones. We're less lonely, we have things to do, we're having more fun. But there's also a lot of benefits that have been found in the research in terms of better school adjustment. We're more happy when we have friends. There's higher rates of school engagement, academic performance. We're better at transitions. We have a higher overall life quality and satisfaction. So friends are important. But we know that kids with autism or individuals with autism have social skills deficits. That's one of the defining characteristics of autism. And that means that because of that deficit, kids with autism are at risk for not having friends or experiencing social isolation, experiencing loneliness. And I think that it's really important to note that we don't always know what the social needs are of any one person. So one person with autism might have these social needs and another person with autism have these social needs, but we should never assume that because you have autism, you don't have a need for social interaction. In fact, the opposite. We know that the majority of people with autism in these studies that have looked at this really do desire friendship, whatever that definition might mean for that one person. There is a desire to be social. Okay, so we know that friends are important and we know that kids with autism have a hard time making friends. So what do we do about that? There are quite a few interventions out there. Some of you might be familiar with quite a few of these. So we've used social stories or social narratives. Video modeling has been used quite successfully. Social thinking is a really popular one, I think particularly in BC right now. Social skills groups, we use lots of visual supports. Pivotal response treatment has been used, and then peer-mediated strategies. So there's lots of things out there. So what do we choose and what are they good for? That kind of thing is important, and lots of that research is happening. So there was a review done in 2010, and basically what they found is that they would endorse ABA-based interventions, so interventions based in applied behavior analysis for autism. Those were effective in the research. Naturalistic interventions, interventions that happen in the natural environment, PRT, pivotal response treatment, and peer-mediated interventions were all things that looked quite promising. At that time, however, they found that there wasn't really much evidence for what was effective for preschool or for kids who are much older. So more research was needed. In 2015, there was the National Standards Project. They also found that social narratives were effective, video modeling was effective, social skills group, PRT, and PMI. And then in 2018, Kay Wallen and Yun, I hope I'm saying those names right, did another review about social skills interventions for ASD. And what they found was that we have lots more information now. We're starting to understand what makes an effective social skills intervention, what the key ingredients are. And they identified some of those key ingredients. So they suggested that an effective social skills intervention has the following: a structured or manualized intervention, that there's regular and frequent contact, that the intervention happen in the natural environment. So this is not about a pullout. Respected learner agency. So this is about everyone having fun and having say and having choice and being involved. There's mutual interests, there's motivation there to do the activity, to learn the skills, to be engaged with peers, and that there's peer involvement. So that's important specifically for maintenance and generalization into the natural environment. So if peers are involved from the beginning, we see greater generalization and maintenance after the intervention ends, and that there's purposeful planning. So not only does the intervention need to be effective, it also needs to be efficient and easy to implement. So it needs to be something that the intervention agents, the teachers, the BCBAs, whoever they are, can implement quite easily. So that takes us into peer-mediated intervention. What is a peer-mediated intervention, PMI? It's really simple. It's the idea that we teach typically developing peers to support a peer with a disability. And that can be to teach them to do almost anything. There's a huge variety in the literature about what we've taught typically developing peers to do with their classmates with a disability, anything from academic to social interaction, behavioral goals. And there's also a huge variety in what that training looks like, how long it takes, what they're teaching the kids to do. But overall, it's all been very, very effective. And there's a strong evidence base, particularly in school settings. So the benefit of using a PMI as a social skills intervention is that the social skills are practiced with real peers in real settings right from the beginning. That's just built into the intervention, and there's regular and frequent opportunities. And that's because if you do this intervention with classmates of a student with autism, they see each other 5 days a week, all day, right? So there's regular and frequent opportunities. It can be incorporated into natural settings and routines. So there's quite a bit of research in both the classroom and a little bit less, but growing research base on the playground. There's potential to promote generalization of skills across settings and peers. We'll talk about that a little bit with the study that I did with Pat. And there's high social validity. So there's satisfaction with the intervention across both the students and the teachers and the parents. Everyone's really happy with it. So that's important. And then there's also this potential to reduce demands on school staff, I work as a consultant for private schools locally. I know that this is really important. This is why I was really interested in this low intensity intervention that we're going to talk about. It's really important that these interventions are not requiring added resources, added time from staff, extra staff, that kind of thing. If we require those types of things, they're less likely to implement them. So a peer-mediated intervention actually reduces demand on the adults who are involved because the student with autism might actually be accessing an intervention just by simply going out onto the playground with his peers. So there are some limitations to what we know about PMIs and whether or not and who they're effective for and in what contexts. So we don't have a ton of research yet with younger students. Although Dr. Ainsley Boudreau did a really great study with preschoolers and found that that was really effective. And there's also very few studies with older students with ASD, so middle school, high school, during unstructured time. So Carter and his group of researchers, they've done quite a few in the classroom, and that's been really effective with high school students, but there's not very much that looks at how do we increase engagement and communication for students during break times when everyone else is typically socializing with their friends. There's also been way more of a focus on looking at students who do not have communication delays, don't have an intellectual disability, more that Asperger's type profile. So we really need to look at doing PMIs with the range that is the autism spectrum. So that brings me to Brain and Miranda, 2019. We did effectiveness of a low-intensity peer-mediated intervention for middle school students with autism spectrum disorder. I'm very excited for my first publication in research in autism spectrum disorders. That's why I'm getting all giddy. It's still very exciting to look at it. So we looked at those gaps that existed in the research and we thought, okay, how many of those gaps can we try and fill in one thesis project? So we'll see. What we wanted to ask was, is there a functional relation between a low intensity PMI, and I'll describe what I mean by that later, and increased social behavior of middle school aged youth with ASD during break and lunch periods on the playground and in the cafeteria. And we specifically looked at engagement, communicative acts, and mutual enjoyment. And then we wanted to know to what extent are these changes maintained at 1 to 4 week follow-up, and what is the social validity? How do the peers and the teachers rate this intervention overall? So we had 3 groups in general. So there were classroom teachers, and then we had students with ASD, and then we had the peer coaches. And we just recruited the classroom teachers based on the fact that they had a student with autism in their classroom who had social interaction engagement goals on their IEP already. So we already knew this was a meaningful goal for those students. And then the classroom teachers nominated peer coaches who met some pretty simple criteria. They had to show some interest in being involved. They maybe had tried to interact with their classmate with autism in the past. Maybe they'd had some interactions. Maybe they sometimes tried to help them in class, that kind of thing. They needed to be in the same class. They needed to not engage in significant problem behavior that would be disruptive. And they needed to have strong social skills themselves. So they were nominated, and then it was completely voluntary, so whether or not they wanted to. Everyone who was nominated was really enthusiastic and excited to be a part of it. So we were really lucky we didn't have any trouble with recruitment at all. Okay, so there were 3 participant groups. Group 1 was Stewart's group. This was a group of grade 6 students. There was a classroom teacher involved and 2 peer coaches. So there was 1 boy and 1 girl. They were both 11, and then there was Stewart. And Stewart was a Chinese-Canadian student with autism. He was 12. He spoke English and some Cantonese at home. He was on a modified academic program with 1-to-1 full-time EA support, so he required a significant amount of support to be in a general education classroom. He spoke in 1 to 4 word phrases with prompting, so he generally tried to speak in 1 word, but with prompting you could get some sentences from him. He was able to make a variety of requests and a few comments, but he had pretty limited conversational skills. So he wasn't engaging in any kind of back and forth reciprocal conversation, particularly with peers. He was pretty independent with his self-help, and he had a nonverbal IQ score of 100, or the 50th percentile on the lighter. At break, he liked to play with Lego and read comic books and go on the computers. So that's group 1. Then we had group 2. This was Thomas's group, and this is a group of grade 7 boys, 4 peer coaches. We actually tried to limit it initially to 3, but there were 4, and they were all adamant that they were going to be the peer coaches, which was a very good problem. So we had 4 peer coaches for this guy. And then there was Stewart, and he was, again, a Chinese-Canadian student with ASD. He was 12. Spoke English, a little bit of Cantonese. Again, a modified academic program, needed significant 1-to-1 support. He was primarily working on a life skills program. And unfortunately, due to significant disruptive problem behavior, spent very little time in the classroom with his peers at that time. He spoke in 1 to 4 word basic requests and had very limited conversational skills and had a nonverbal IQ score of 49 or below the 1st percentile. And his only break preference was to go on the swings. That will come up later. And then our final group is Alexander's group, and these were grade 8 boys. So we had 3 peer coaches in this group. Alexander, Chinese-Canadian. I don't remember the statistics, but just in case anyone's wondering, these were all students at the same school, and I think 95% of the student population is Chinese. So we didn't just pick Chinese students, that was, you know. It was a modified to adapted academic program depending on the subject for this student. He needed moderate to significant support depending, again, on the subject. Spoke in 1 to 4 word basic requests. He could make some comments, so his verbal skills were a little bit higher about the immediate environment and events, but he had limited conversational skills again, rarely initiated, and primarily engaged with peers by scripting movies. Nonverbal IQ score of 100 or the 50th percentile, and he enjoyed quite a few different break activities, basketball and soccer, for example. Okay, so now this is what we did. So this all took place at the same school. They're all students in the same school. The peer coach training that we did took place just in empty classrooms at lunch breaks. We then had baseline intervention and follow-up just wherever the students were allowed to be at break. So we put no constraints on them. They weren't separated in another room or told you have to stay on the field or anything like that. It was just wherever they wanted to go. So the research assistants and I did a lot of running around for this study. And anything that was available to any students at breaks were available for the students for the study. So there was Lego available or playground computers, et cetera, anything you might expect to see they had. Into the nitty-gritty of measurement. So we used partial interval recording, 10-minute sessions at break times for 30-second intervals. So did they or did they not engage in those variables that we were looking at? So there was a percent of intervals with peer engagement, and we defined peer engagement as mutual participation in a shared activity. And we spent a lot of time defining what that actually meant, and we were pretty stringent in our criteria for mutual participation or peer engagement. So if it was parallel play, so playing next to each other, but there was no communication back and forth, this was not engagement. So we really wanted to make sure we were truly looking at kids playing together, not just proximity, right? So an example of that would be Thomas on the swings. So he was on the swings a lot. If he was swinging next to a peer coach is swinging, he's swinging, but they're not talking to each other, they're not looking at each other, they're not laughing with each other. This was not engagement for this study. So we were pretty strict about what we were counting. However, if they were engaging in parallel play and during that same 30-second interval, they also engaged in some sort of communication back and forth, that would be counted as engagement. So they're swinging on the swings and the peer coach says, "Are you having fun, Thomas?" And he says, "Yeah." Then now this is peer engagement because we're doing the same activity together and we're talking about it. So then we also looked at the percent of intervals with a communicative act, and we defined communicative acts, and we call them CAs because communicative acts is hard to say over and over. So CAs, gestures, facial expressions, verbal utterances, vocalizations directed towards a peer. So this is not, I'm talking to myself, I'm scripting a movie to myself. This is, my communicative act is directed towards you. That could be something like the peer says, "Hey, pass the ball," and Alexander throws the ball. And it could be something like, "Hi, Pat Miranda," right? So anything from a gesture or a nonverbal response to someone else's communication, all of those things were counted as communicative acts. And we did separate initiations and responses. I'm not talking about that too much. Today I didn't separate them on the graph, but I'll talk about that a little bit. We also looked at mutual enjoyment, so we really wanted to make sure everyone was having fun. That was kind of the point. So thinking back on the definition of friendship and that we want to be engaging in a shared activity and having fun doing it, so how are we going to know if they're having fun? So we defined that just how we could using observable measures. So are they making eye contact with each other? Are they smiling at each other? Are they laughing with each other? And again, we were pretty strict about that. So in order to count mutual enjoyment, both the peer coach and the participant with ASD needed to be laughing or smiling at each other. Then we also measured social validity. We used questionnaires for the classroom teachers and the peer coaches at the end. So we used a non-concurrent, multiple baseline, multiple probe design across 3 groups of participants. And participants were randomly assigned baseline lengths. I'm not going to go too much into that today. Okay, so the first phase was baseline. And baseline was just, we showed up at the school, we didn't give any instructions to anybody. We went out on break, and for 10 minutes we watched to see what are these kids with autism doing during their break times without any intervention in place. So we measured all those things we already talked about, the percentage of peer engagement, percentage of CAs, mutual enjoyment, and we also looked to see, are the peer coaches who are about to get this training, are they already doing some of the strategies that we want to teach them? So we looked at all those things in baseline. The next phase, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this part because if I were you, that's what I'd be most interested in. What did you actually do in the peer training? So we did two 20 to 25 minute training sessions during break times at school. So they didn't miss any academic times, and they didn't even miss their whole lunch period. They were able to eat while we did the training, and then they went out and still got their 25 minutes of hanging out time. So it was really undisruptive. First, we identified mutual interests and preferences, things they like to do at break. And then we used behavioral skills training to teach 3 key strategies. And those key strategies were things that were pulled from the existing PMI literature and kind of put into a pretty little package to make it easy to remember. So we called them do, help, and talk. And don't worry, I'll talk about those in a minute. So to identify the mutual interests and preferences, prior to the peer coach training, we handed out these preference inventories to the classroom teachers. And we asked them to identify places that their student with autism liked to go during breaks, what they like to play with, what they like to do, what they were interested in general. And we got those back. And then we'll come back to that in a minute. So we go into session 1. Session 1, we went around, we made introductions. So most of the students knew their classmate with autism already. This was someone who'd been in their class for a long time. This is a private school. Some of them had been in school together for years and years already, so they knew their classmate. We didn't talk about autism. We just talked about that particular student, how they communicated best, what they like to do. We opened it up for questions. Do you have any questions about why your classmate screams really loudly, for example, out of nowhere? So we talked about those things, had a really open, safe conversation about that. And then actually the peer coaches were really knowledgeable overall. They had some really good insight. They knew their classmates. And then we talked about what they like to do at break. What are you currently doing at break? Be honest, what do you do? Tell me what you do. And we wrote them all down. And then we pulled out that checklist, and we found anything that matched. Because again, remembering what we said at the beginning, that friendship is based in us doing something that we both like together. So it was important that we identified what are those things we both like, what's possible, what can we do here. And luckily for us, we found something that matched in every case, more for some than others. Then we introduced the first strategy. So once we've decided, okay, in Alexander's group, everyone likes basketball. That one was awesome. So now we're introducing strategy number 1, which is do, and I'm going to use behavioral skills training to teach that, which is describing, providing written instructions, modeling what that looks like. So I would actually act it out, and then we'd role play. All the peer coaches would have an opportunity to practice the strategy, and then I'd give them some feedback, and we'd practice again as we needed. And we would use the activity that they'd identified as a mutual interest for the context of our role play. So for Alexander, we all pretended to play basketball as we practiced the strategy. And then we had peer coach training session 2. We reviewed strategy number 1 and introduced strategies 2 and 3, which were help and talk, and again used the same strategies for teaching those. And by the end of session 2, we would combine all the strategies into one role play. So we're playing basketball, and we're going to do the do strategy, now we're doing the help strategy, and now we're doing the talk strategy, all within one role play. And then that was it. So I want to go over what the strategies actually are. So what you're seeing up in your slides and on the screen is the written instructions part of the behavioral skills training. So this is what the peer coaches were actually given. So strategy number 1 is do, and this is about doing something that will be fun for everyone. This is something that we've already identified those, right? Alexander's group, we all like playing basketball, cool. So if your friend is already, or if your classmate, we're not necessarily friends yet, if your classmate is already playing basketball, you can join in. That's the do strategy. You can say, hey Alexander, I'm going to join in with you. I'm going to play basketball with you. Or if your classmate's doing something you don't want to do, that's not fun for you, or they're maybe not doing anything, you can say hello and then give them some choices of things that we've already identified as being things we both like to do. So for Alexander's group, they might say, hey Alexander, do you want to play basketball or catch? Right? So that's the do strategy. Pretty easy. The next strategy is help, and this strategy is about helping your classmate do activities with you. And so this is about what if Alexander chose basketball, and now he's standing there, and he's not actually playing basketball, but he said he wanted to play basketball, but he's just standing there. Maybe he needs some help to play basketball. Maybe he's not really sure what to do. And so there's some strategies that you can use to help him. You can tell him how to do it. You can say, oh, Alexander, first you bounce the ball, and then you throw it in the hoop. And then you show him, here, let me show you. I'm not good at basketball. And then you can say, hey, Alexander, it's your turn. You try. If your friend is still not engaging with you in that activity, maybe they made a mistake. Maybe they changed their mind. Maybe they don't want to play. Let's go back to the do strategy. Maybe give them some different choices. So that's the help. And the last one is talk. And this strategy is about talking to your classmate. And this one was an interesting one because on one hand, it was really important, and I really wanted to emphasize that we don't talk to our peers who maybe have a communication delay as though they're babies. It's really, really important that we talk to them with respect and in an age-appropriate way. However, when I talked to a group of 13-year-old boys and I said, how do you show your friends that you like them? Oh, I insult them. I tell them they're stupid. And then they know that we're friends. Like, okay, so don't do that. Super. So this part of the strategy, or this part of the training, we talked a lot about, okay, so your classmate doesn't understand sarcasm. Your classmate needs to be told specifically, hey, I'm having fun right now, but do that in an age-appropriate and cool way. So we actually brainstormed ways to give compliments in a 13-year-old boy way, and I wish I'd kept the list, honestly, because it wasn't things I would have said. And I was really glad that I did that part of it, that I was like, hey, what would you say to each other, except for minus the insults part. And they came up with some good ones. I think there was a lot of like, wicked and stuff like that. I don't know. So in the talking strategy, you want to show classmates that you like hanging out with them and talking with them. And you can do that by smiling, by giving high fives, and age-appropriate, cool compliments. Be a little more positive and enthusiastic than you might be with your other 13-year-old friends, but yeah. And then you can also talk about what you're doing, and you can ask questions. And those strategies will help your friend talk to you, and will help you get to know them better. So those are the 3 strategies. Do help talk. It's pretty easy. Okay, so once the training was done, we went into intervention. And basically, we just went back to what baseline looked like. We'd now done the training. We said to the peer coaches, you don't have to play with your classmate every day. But now you have these strategies. So if you want to, you can use those strategies and see what happens and see if you guys can have fun together. We really emphasize it's super important that you continue to have fun. These are your breaks too. And this should not become about, oh, I'm giving up my break for my classmate. So that was all. We sent them on their way, and we started to take data and see if we made any changes. So we continued that phase until, after each session where we were taking data, there was a probe, I would give some feedback to the peer coaches. And this was usually like 10 seconds because the bell would have rung, they're rushing back into class, and so I'd be jogging along them being like, hey, I really like how you did the do strategy. Maybe tomorrow you could do more of the talk strategy. Okay, bye. And that was it. Okay, so we continued that phase until the participant with ASD achieved either 70% or higher engagement, and either 70% or higher total CAs, or no improvement in CAs after 3 consecutive probes. And then the final phase was follow-up. So we did this 1 to 4 weeks post-intervention. The reason for that length was that it was the end of the school year. I think my last data point was actually the last day of school in June. So I was really pushing it. We didn't provide any additional training or support during the follow-up. We just showed up again and took some data. And we used the exact same procedures. We didn't give any feedback at that time, just a lot of praise, like, hey, you're doing awesome. We didn't give them any prompting or corrections. And here are our results. Can everyone see? So I think it's quite pretty. Just saying. Okay, but the first thing I want to point out is baseline. Because for me, baseline was kind of, it actually still makes me feel sad looking at it. Because these were kids that I knew. And to actually have data to show how socially isolated these kids were on the playground was pretty startling, really. So during baseline, not one single peer talked to them, tried to play with them, and they didn't try to play or talk to anyone else. And I think what's really interesting too is that I'm often told in my role, well, break time is their break, and social demands are demanding, and they should be given a break. Okay, that's fair. We all need a break. My argument would be, does it have to be at lunchtime? because when do kids make friends and when do they practice their friendships? They practice them at lunch breaks. So to be like, we're only going to practice social skills with this kid in the classroom where the other kids aren't really working on that at that time doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Anyways, a little bit of soapbox there. So yeah, we were getting no interaction. And then what we see, what we see at the point of intervention for all 3 participants was an immediate increase in engagement. This is engagement, that we're looking at right now, not the communication. For Stuart, it looks almost fake, right? But we had 0% engagement in baseline and then 100% engagement during intervention. And then a week later, we came back and it was still looking pretty good. It was like 85 or 90% there. Thomas was interesting, so no engagement at all during baseline. And then we went into intervention and we were like, okay, there's a little bit more engagement. It's not amazing. What we realized is that Thomas took a really long time to eat his lunch, and the peer coaches had decided that they shouldn't bug him while he was eating. And so they were waiting till he was finished eating, and then he would have like 5 minutes left of the lunch break outside. And so he was engaged during those 5 minutes with his peers, but it wasn't happening. So the only thing that happened here was we said, how about you go inside and invite him to come outside with you instead of waiting for him? That's it. That's all that happened. So that was just more of a logistics thing. And yeah, you see nice steady improvement, and then some nice maintenance here. Wasn't as steady, but still really strong compared to baseline. Alexander, again, interesting. Alexander was a little bit of a different story. So he was really surprised when peers started interacting with him. And he seemed really excited about it, but he wasn't really sure how to handle it. And so he'd be part of the group, and then he'd leave the group. And then he'd be like, okay, I'm back. And then he'd leave the group. And you could see he was really excited and nervous and wasn't really sure what this was all about. And so the first session, the peer coaches had to work quite hard to be like, hey, come back. We want you to be part of the group. The next session, the peer coaches just didn't hang out with him. I was a little disappointed that day. But I think, to be honest, when you look at what's happening in the natural environment, we should expect some variability. In fact, this looks a lot more realistic than this one, right? Not everyone hangs out with someone every lunch break, and the same kids don't play with each other every single lunch break. So that's okay. And we came back from it. And we saw some really nice progress there. Same thing in follow-up. I was really nervous when we came in for follow-up and no one was playing with him again. I'm like, oh no, this hasn't maintained at all. But then we came in a few days later and it was back to 100. So I think it's just that natural variability. Also, this happened in a natural setting. Kids have clubs. Kids have school jobs. Kids get sick. Whatever. We continue taking data because we were doing. The other thing to notice about this graph is that we also paid attention to who they were playing with. We wanted to make sure it wasn't just one peer coach. And what we found, it's kind of hard to see, but what we did find is that all the peer coaches were engaging with their classmate with autism. And really excitingly, especially for Alexander, what the asterisk means is that there was an untrained peer that was present. So here you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, right? So here we have no kids playing with Alexander. Now we have peer coaches playing with Alexander. Now we have peer coaches and his untrained peers playing with Alexander, just from less than an hour of intervention, right? And we even saw untrained peers playing with him over here, 15 school days later. So, yes?
Do the points indicate both the responses to peers and initiations?
Sorry, this one's engagement. We're jumping right now. Here you go. So this is communicative acts, and yes, both responses and initiations are combined in this graph. The reason for that is we really didn't see very significant increases in initiations. I do think that makes sense. We didn't do any direct intervention with the student with autism at all. I literally never spoke to the student with autism. And so it would have been super cool if we'd seen that increase in initiations, but it's not really shocking that we didn't. There was no prompting for the student with autism, no reinforcement for the student with autism, nothing like that. So a little bit not as significant as the engagement, but but keeping in mind these are all students with significant communication delays. So we have Stuart up there, and he engaged in, around 80% of the time of the intervals. He was engaging or communicating with his peers, and that maintained a follow-up. Thomas, he floated around the 35%, but again, we were really excited about that compared to baseline for this particular student. Something that's interesting about baseline that I forgot to point out is all three of them had this little random blip, and in each case, that was them initiating with a peer, kind of randomly. So here we have 1. It's a little bit above 0, right? It was at 1 interval out of the 10 minutes, there was an initiation. Here, there was 1 interval with an initiation, 1 interval with an initiation. To me, that kind of tells a story of like motivation. It didn't go anywhere, and it was very minor, and there wasn't a lot of it, but it was there. But what we weren't seeing was peers doing the same, right? Okay, so same thing, the letters are the same and the asterisks are the same. And again, when you see the lower ones, those are the days when there were no peer coaches around. So then we looked at mutual enjoyment. So Stuart, let me see. Stuart, there were signs of mutual enjoyment for 75% of sessions, and then Thomas and Alexander were both 100. Stuart, there's a couple things that could be about. They primarily played in the library, and they did Lego. So you're supposed to be quiet in the library. I don't know. So it was a little bit more of a low-key kind of activity that they primarily engaged in. And so there is a chance maybe we didn't quite capture with what we were looking at, whether or not they were enjoying themselves. But 75% was still pretty high, and we had 100% and 100% for Thomas and Alexander. And then here's our social validity. We had really high social validity measures. So overall, everyone strongly or agreed or strongly agreed with all of the following. They were excited to be peer coaches. They felt confident about their ability to be a peer coach after the training. They learned helpful strategies. They did not think participating had a negative impact on their social life, which is something that we were concerned about and keeping an eye on. They said they had fun during the training. Most of them would recommend, actually I think they would all recommend being a peer coach to their friends, but they were more at like agree rather than strongly agree. They would be a peer coach again in the future, and they all considered the classmate now that they coach to be a friend. They think other kids should be peer coaches, and overall they did enjoy being in the project. Okay, so this was really interesting because this all looks beautiful, lovely, and then we asked if you have any comments, write down your comments. And this was really helpful and interesting, even though not all of it was as positive as I would like, but we learned something from that, right? So Stuart was great. So Stuart, his first peer coach, said, I had a lot of fun peer coaching Stuart because I felt like Stuart feels more welcome here because he knows he has friends there for him. And his other peer coach said, it was very fun to play with Stuart and learn the strategies. Thomas, one peer coach said, peer coaching is beneficial for both sides of the coaching. I really like this program. The next said, peer coaching with Thomas has been fun and has brought me joy. Most importantly, it has brought me a new friend that I can interact with more. So 12 and 13-year-old boys are my new favorite group of people. Okay, and then we got this one, and Pat and I were like, oh. I like coaching Thomas, but the lack of response from him makes me feel that my acts are useless. I also dislike that I constantly do swings and push, making me feel more like a servant than a friend. But that's really important, super important to know, and I'm so glad that we randomly put that, not randomly, but we put comments at the bottom, and I wasn't expecting all of them to write comments, but they all wrote comments, and that one was really important. And there's a couple of things I personally take away from that. One is that Thomas only had one preference, one thing he wanted to do at break times, and that was swings. And how many, his group were 12-year-olds, how many 12-year-olds, they were actually quite happy to play on the swings. It was a middle school, so not all schools have middle schools, but middle school, it's this kind of like gray area where it's kind of still, like half of them do play on the playground, so okay. But they would be moving on to high school. There isn't even a swing set. So how long would that actually go on. They all said, oh, no, we want to play swings. We want to play swings. I'd say, well, why don't you give him choices of other things? No, he loves the swings. We'll play swings with him. So that's what they were telling me. But that tells me as a clinician how important it is that we are really focusing on teaching leisure skills to kids with autism, because this becomes this really significant barrier to them being able to have friends, right? So even when we did this intervention, it was really effective. I don't think that if I came back 2 months later, they'd still be pushing him on the swings. I mean, I'd be pretty surprised, right? So that was one takeaway for me, is what we can do as professionals working with this population. The other thing is we really need to think about, it would have been really great to have that information not at the end, right? So I feel like there's things I could have done to help. For example, lack of response from him makes me feel that my acts are useless. Thomas, he was the one that was below the first percentile. So he didn't have typical ways of showing that he was having fun. He maybe responded to 1 out of 10 of their attempts to communicate with him. So a lot of their attempts were punished, really, right? Like they weren't getting a lot back. And so I think in a situation like that, where you know that the student maybe isn't going to be giving a lot back, that reciprocity is missing perhaps, especially in the beginning, that we look at other forms of reinforcement for peer coaches. And that's something I would do differently in the future. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about that. And then, yeah, again, so Alexander, we have some really nice comments to read. So thank you for having or teaching me. I will make sure Alexander has an astonishing future. It was evident that he had a lot of fun, and I'm thankful that you taught me and my fellow peer coaches to communicate with him. And then again, I really enjoyed being a peer coach, but I think there should be more peer coaches so it doesn't feel like a job or a chore. So we never told the peer coaches that they had to interact, but they took it on themselves as this responsibility. We are now the peer coaches. We have to go out, even though we said over and over, make sure you're having fun too. And they did. You know, we saw them having fun. But I think this is really important and it's something that I know schools are concerned about, as they should be, right? So this is something we have to really plan for. How to make sure kids don't feel this burden. We want it to be a choice. We want it to be organic and everyone to be having fun. How do we in the future watch for that a little bit more closely? This peer coach thought that it would be solved by training more peers. So I thought I was like, thanks, that's helpful. The teachers really loved the intervention, which was really exciting, particularly because one of the teachers was a little bit more hesitant than the others, and I got her in the end. In the end, her social validity was really high, so I was really pleased with that. They thought that peer training was a good way to address the social needs of students. They would like to see more peer training for students in the future. They thought that the student with autism benefited socially. They thought the peer coaches benefited socially. In fact, I thought that was pretty cool to see that that was even slightly higher. They thought that the peer coaches benefited even more significantly than they thought the student with autism did, which is something that I feel is true, but it was really cool to see that come out. The student with autism has more friends as a result of the study. They all thought that was true for their students. They did not think the study was disruptive to their class or their students. It's very important. I think other students would benefit. Yes, the peer coaches enjoyed participating, and they strongly agreed that the amount of time required to participate was reasonable for all students. And really interestingly, they really all were interested to learn how to train students themselves to be peer coaches, which is what I'm hoping to do with my PhD. Okay, so some comments from teachers. Stuart's teacher didn't make a comment. They were optional. Thomas's teacher said, I was thrilled to participate in the study. The benefits far exceeded my expectations. The opportunity to learn about peer coaching will definitely build momentum in a positive way for all involved. Thank you. And Alexander's teacher said, this was such a wonderful opportunity for both my peer coaches and my student with autism. All three coaches had an extremely positive experience, and the student with autism is now being invited to join friends at lunch and break and has been communicating more. The coaches have also helped to calm him down when stressed. I would love to see more training at our school in the future. Thanks. I thought so too. There might have been a tear or two. Okay, so what did we learn? What are the advantages? So we found that with less than 1 hour of intervention, we saw really significant effects, right? It took less than an hour, and then every once in a while we gave like 30 seconds of feedback. Nice job. That was it, right? And schools may be more likely to adopt an intervention like this. It really doesn't take a ton of resources. It's not really disrupting class time, and it doesn't take very long. We also found that middle school students with varying abilities, so none of our participants in this study would have fit that kind of Asperger's type profile, and we had high social validity from students and teachers. So looking back at that Kay et al. Review and what they said were key ingredients, there's no manual yet for this, but I would like to look into that. There was regular and frequent contact. This happened in the natural environment. We respected learner agency. I'm going to talk about that in a minute in limitations as well, but we really based this on mutual interests, as we talked about a lot, and choice was involved. The motivation was part of it. Definitely peer involvement, and definitely purposeful planning. It was effective, and it was efficient, and in my opinion, very easy to implement. There were some limitations though, so we didn't see an increase in initiations. So no direct intervention with students with ASD, and we didn't see that. Participants with autism were not included in the planning, and they were not included in the training. So, and also social validity measures were not collected for participants with ASD. I'm currently working with a school, and we're setting up a peer coaching session for one of their students, and this student is more highly verbal. And so right now we're going back and forth and working out how can we involve that student in a way that's really respectful and that they're going to feel comfortable. So that's something I'm interested in as well, moving forward. But in this case, how could we have included them in a way that was meaningful when these participants weren't really able to fill out a questionnaire about what they like to do. Their yes-no for most of them was not really consistent, so we couldn't even say, do you like this, yes or no? But maybe we could have used some picture symbols. There's different ways that we could have included them more. I'd like to see that in the future. We don't know long-term maintenance, and we don't know if you guys all go out into the world and do this tomorrow. We don't know if it'll be effective or not. We just know that in this context, with me being the intervention agent that it was. Okay, so in the future, as I kind of touched on already, we'd like to include individuals with ASD as research partners. We want to continue to include participants who represent the wide spectrum of ASD in terms of age, sex, communication ability, all those things. It would be interesting to combine a PMI with an intervention that taught students to initiate as well, to see if we had an even greater effect. And we want to support students with ASD who have limited interest to expand their leisure repertoire. So important. I immediately went from doing this study to all of my private clients now have a leisure program. And I talk about it every team meeting about how important it is. And finally, a future direction would be to investigate a train the trainer application of this intervention package, and that simply means, can we train teachers or EAs or people who are already on school teams to be the peer coach trainers, because then we'll really see this take off, if that can be effective. And that's all. Thank you.
We have some time for questions.
We do.
So ask away.
Please. Yes.
I have a question. That was really great, Thea.
Thank you.
I really, that comment at the end from one of the teachers saying that there continues to be interaction with the peer coaches and the kid is great. So this might kind of take away my question. My question is, did the presence of coders have an effect on, because they were saying things like, it's my job, I can do it. When someone's watching you do your job, you kind of do your job. And when you came back for follow-up, again, you came back. And so do you think that had any effect?
I think it had to have had some effect. But there's a couple of reasons why I don't think it was as critical.
Okay.
I work at that school, so I'm there quite often. All the students were at the school at the same time. They didn't necessarily know who I was watching. And I also had anecdotal reports from the teachers coming in about what was happening when I wasn't there. But yes, absolutely. I'm sure there was an element of, oh, there's that person standing there with a clipboard. again.
Because you taught them, and then they're like, oh, here she is.
Yes.
And I better
Right.
go push them on this way.
Yes, exactly, exactly. I also didn't have time to, so I had, these were going on at the same time. There was 3 of them. It was a 30-minute break, 10-minute sessions. I sometimes watched all 3 in one because of the timeline. It was crazy. But I couldn't even cheat if I wanted to, is what I'm trying to say. I had to literally go in and do the session wherever they were at. And so a lot of the time I would come in and I didn't even see the initial do strategy because they were already engaged in something. So yeah, I think absolutely, of course. But I also think, thinking about a school setting, EAs are already out there. If EAs become the ones who are doing the training, then they're already out there and they're the ones taking the data, it becomes a non-issue.
Yeah, I'm just thinking from the kids' perspective.
Absolutely. Yes, and that there might have been some anxiety.
Right?
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
She's there,
Yes.
so I should perform.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. We tried to minimize that to the best of our ability, but
Yeah.
honestly, like during Alexander's first intervention session. So during baseline, Alexander stood in a bush and he threw pine cones at a fence. And so there was no way to be discreet about that. We were standing in a bush with him. But he was used to having EAs and adults follow him. So he was fine. But then the first day of intervention, the peer coaches all came in the bush. And so we were all in the bush. But as time went on, it became a lot more natural. So I might just be standing here and they're playing basketball there. And there's lots of adults around. And yeah, but it's absolutely a concern. That's why natural environment research is hard.
Question.
Yes.
For your 3 key strategies, do, help, talk.
Yes.
Is there something that we could look into? Is it from a resource or curriculum?
Not yet.
So that's from you?
Yes, so
Okay.
we came up with do, help, and talk, but we pulled from the existing research. So it was about prompting, it was about providing reinforcement, initiating, those were the main ones. So initiating an activity, prompting is the helping, reinforcement is part of the talking. Yeah, so if you look through, but it is interesting in the literature we call them all, everyone calls things different things. So that was a little bit hard to pull from. Are we all talking about the same thing? I think so. Yeah. So the package isn't actually there other than this article. Hi, Mari.
For a wonderful presentation.
Thank you for being
Really
here.
enjoyed it.
Mari is my best friend's mom.
Just happened to live here. I wanted to know more about how you approach the peer coaches for this. Maybe I think you did introduce a bit of the process, but maybe learning a bit more about that because
Yeah.
the role is so important, and it's at that age specifically that kids are like, what do
Yeah.
others think about me, especially in a social situation.
Unfortunately, I can't tell you a ton about that because the teachers did it and I wasn't there. And we did that because the teachers had a relationship with them already and we didn't want to put pressure on them. And so I think they were approached individually, discreetly.
Very important.
Yeah, I can't really tell you much more
But it
than that.
was more about based on a relationship, right? That
Yeah, they already had it, right.
That's
Yes,
where
it wasn't an unknown researcher approaching them.
researcher.
Yeah, yeah.
That tells me lots of
Thanks, Mary. Any other questions?
It was very interesting.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.